Hello and welcome, my name is Jason, and today we're going to be continuing the series of miniature paintings that I was working on in the last video with the next two paintings in this series. These will be made on 5x5 cradled wood panels, and I'll be using Holbein acrylic gouache inside my spirograph tin that I've made into a makeshift wet palette. These are the acrylic gouaches that I'll be using today, a pretty wide selection. I'm pretty much using the majority of these colors within this piece. And yeah, we'll jump into the actual painting itself. So in the last video, I kind of talked about how I didn't really like working on the wood, but the deadline for this gallery that I'm hoping to submit these miniatures to was coming up pretty quickly. So I didn't really have too much time to prime each of the panels and let them dry before being able to paint over them. So I kind of just went with the process and just dealt with me not liking kind of working on these wood surfaces. And that's perfectly fine. It's not that I necessarily like hate working on those wood surfaces. I just don't necessarily like the texture. And I think maybe putting like a gesso over the top of the panel would probably make it feel a little nicer to paint over the top of. Especially if I were to use something like a Daniel Smith's watercolor ground, or maybe just an acrylic ground. I think that would probably be just fine, especially since this is basically acrylic that I'm using, just a more matte version. So I'm starting in with the sketch for this piece. Now this concept is within the same realm of the previous painting from the last video of animals being commuters to and from work. And so this one was, I had the concept of wanting to draw and paint the light rail, because the light rail across the bridge, the 2 line across I-90 in Seattle, had just opened up, and I've been recently riding it quite a bit recently to go visit friends. So I had the idea of wanting to paint a scene from and on the light rail. Now, a lot of the times when I'm on the light rail, I end up encountering a lot of sports fans, people going to the stadium, people coming from the stadium. And so this concept kind of just reminded me of those times when I've kind of been stuck on the light rail with a bunch of other sports fans. Now, I'm not a sports fan myself, but I found it to be really kind of a fun concept. And I know a lot of people who are really interested in all kinds of different sports. So this was kind of an homage to being on the train with a lot of other people going to those various games in downtown. So yeah, this particular piece is, again, I'm kind of following through with the frog concept. I like frogs a lot. You'll probably notice that from some previous paintings, the last one as well. I think they're really just kind of fun to draw and paint. So that's something that I kind of have been enjoying doing a little bit of in these recent pieces, just to kind of make it a little more interesting than just drawing, people on the train. Like it kind of gives my own flair, my own style into it, because I tend to do a lot of animals and animal portraits. So this just kind of gives it my own vibe with this particular piece. So I'm having a lot of fun with doing these kind of concepts. And you'll see, so I'm going to be working on this first one, and then I have a second one that I'll show a little bit later in this video. That'll be a similar concept, but a different mode of transportation that you'll see in a little bit. But yeah, for this one, I was having a good time with drawing from all of the perspective here. It's a pretty complicated piece, but it all kind of boiled down to a single point perspective. Now, it's going to be really challenging when I get into the actual painting process, because there's so much detail behind the frog. So many other like layers and the actual train cars that continue and extend forward. And I kind of blocked a lot of it with having the frog kind of standing in the middle of the aisleway, like holding on to the railings. But I'm still having to figure out how to actually abstract a lot of the detail in that kind of mid-ground area, just to make it a little easier on myself and make it look a little more like almost like a photograph where like the background is a little blurred out. And so that I don't really have to worry about rendering everything in perfect detail. So that'll really help out with this piece kind of during the painting process. And yeah, as you'll see, I'm kind of drawing in some other characters. I have the two frogs here, maybe the same frogs from the last scene, but they could be completely different. I kind of modeled the frogs after different species. Like you'll notice these ones look a little different. The first ones from the last video looked maybe a little more like toads. These maybe look a little bit more like a tree frog or something like that. I'm not too familiar with different frog species, but I kind of was intentionally making some variety in the certain species so that I had just a little more interest in each piece. So yeah, I'm just about ready to finish the sketch here, just bringing in the last little details on some of these characters, like their little hands kind of holding on to some of the railings. And then with this sketch in place, I pretty much have everything here that will allow me to just kind of paint over everything really easily, because I'll mostly be kind of painting within the lines. I've got all the construction areas looking really nice and neat, so it shouldn't be too hard to just kind of paint over the top. So I won't have to do too much kind of problem solving as I'm going through the painting process. So here with the background, I'm going in with kind of lighter washes of paint. Now this is the acrylic gouache, so it operates a little like acrylic, but also like gouache. So you definitely want to work in thin layers and then build up from those thinner layers into those thicker coats. For this, I still wanted the background to be really blurry because I want to give it that kind of photographic effect as you're looking towards the background, especially because there's so much detail on the light rail in this particular photo of all like the little seams of the train car, the different cars like going off in the distance, and all the railings and the handles. There's just so much detail that it got really, in the sketching stage, it did get a little overwhelming to try to figure out like what I wanted to be in the piece. But once I got this solid foundation there, it really started to feel a lot more natural to start painting everything in. And then I started to get a sense for how I actually wanted the piece to look in the end, once I started getting in the background and kind of blurring out some of those areas. Now, the easiest way to do this with the acrylic gouache is to take kind of a damp brush after you've painted in certain areas. Take your damp brush and just kind of blend out the edges of things just to give a really soft edge. And you kind of have to do that while the paint is wet, because this is basically acrylic, so it's going to dry to a permanent layer if you're not careful. Or it will dry to a permanent layer always, but if you're not careful, you'll get those like kind of really sharp edges to things that'll make it a lot harder to, kind of get your edge quality looking the way you want it to look. And that's a big distinction from various media and kind of the style that comes with those particular painting mediums is the edge quality. Like with oil paint, you can get your edges looking like incredibly soft because the paint stays open and wet for quite a long time. But with acrylic, like it dries in a matter of minutes. So the edges tend to be a lot sharper. And that just is more or less a stylistic choice that comes from, painting with acrylic versus something like oil. You can definitely get around some of those things using certain mediums, but for the most part, it is generally, you'll generally see a lot of those sharper edges with some of these paintings here. But I certainly kind of like it. The style is something that I quite enjoy, so I'm not, I tend to really like this style, so I'm very much enjoying using this particular medium. So yeah, as you'll see, I definitely have the background kind of blurred out a little bit, but am going through kind of just filling in all the details. At this point, it starts to feel like a more complicated paint by numbers, because you have all of the areas drawn out where each individual color is going to be. And when there is a color that has, or an area that has multiple colors in there, I will kind of separate those in the sketch with a line to help distinguish those areas. So like the highlights on the chairs, I've sketched in the lines to show where that highlight's supposed to be. But for the most part, it really becomes very easy when you have a really solid foundation, a really solid foundational drawing, to get in all the paint and know exactly where it's supposed to be. I try to make sure I do as much of the problem solving at the kind of beginning of the painting process. So kind of towards the drawing process, I really tried to do a lot of the problem solving then. And I know that there is a good amount of problem solving, like with the background, the midground to background, trying to figure out how blurry I wanted that to be to kind of abstract from the stuff going on in the foreground. But for the most part, the sketch really helped me not have to figure out like where all the placement of things were, where all like the shadow shapes were going to be, because I already had a good sense for the construction of everything. And of course, for this particular piece, I was using some photo references from the light rail because I wanted it to very much be reminiscent of the actual light rail to make sure it was like very, very noticeable, especially this show that I'm hoping to submit these to being in the, greater Seattle area. It was important to kind of indicate or be reminiscent of, the life of, being in the city and what ways of which people tend to commute to and from work or to like sports games. Like in this particular case, I really wanted to call upon that and just kind of have a way to kind of connect with the people in that way. So I think one of the hard parts about this particular painting was the lighting was really interesting. It had that fluorescent overhead lighting, which made everything, not as visually interesting. Shadows were a little on the flatter side, but it did have that direction of being overhead. So we did have some shadows kind of on the bottom sides of most objects in the scene. But I did find it initially kind of, not really something that was too appealing to me at the beginning, because I was like, well, the lighting doesn't look exactly, really inspiring. So it made me kind of be a little hesitant about creating this piece. But then once I started to actually get in the characters and see like some of the lighting that I could do, the lighting effects I could do on like the clothing and on the frog's head, it started to feel a little more interesting and just a little more natural. And, not every piece has to have like strong directional lighting or sunset lighting, things like that. Like there's a place for, paintings like this where you can have all kinds of different lighting situations. So yeah, it was really just kind of interesting to get these characters kind of drawn in, painted in, especially with this particular lighting. But I think in the end, it actually kind of worked out. And I think this painting's really fun and enjoyable. And like I said, I'm not a sports fan, but I found that it was really fun to get in the different jerseys, the colors on the jerseys. And I thought it was really nice, and figured I have people in my life that are, Mariners fans. And I thought it would be really nice to, kind of paint something that they would find enjoyable, and definitely to get their reaction was really special to see them kind of see themselves reflected in the painting in a way, even though it's not like a, portrait of those people, but they still found it really enjoyable to see like, oh, that's like us, like on the train. And so that was really special to kind of show those people in my life this particular piece. And with that, we can call this second painting of animals commuting finished. Now, jumping into this third painting, I was trying to think about a couple of different ways to do this, and I was struggling a lot to figure out what transportation method, what kind of ways I would want these next animals, particularly frogs, to be commuting somewhere in the city. And I wanted it to be really reminiscent of the city. I wanted it to be like an iconic form of transportation within Seattle itself. That way, when people look at it, they'll say like, oh, that's like exactly Seattle. Like we had the ferry before, iconic to the Puget Sound area. We had the light rail, something that's been around for a really long time, but especially with like the new 2 line opening up, that's definitely something that is very Seattle focused. I thought initially I wanted to do something about the metro buses, the regular buses that kind of go throughout the city. But I thought that didn't feel necessarily specifically Seattle. That could be almost anywhere in the country, or even elsewhere outside of the country. It would have to be specifically like, what are specific icons that the Seattle buses have that other buses don't necessarily have? And that was particularly hard because I didn't really have time to like go get references, and there wasn't really any references online that I could find of good like interior shots of the bus. And even if there were some, they just were like really uninspiring. I was thinking a lot about the monorail in downtown Seattle, which I've actually never ridden, but that is definitely something I've seen quite a few times, like just driving or walking through Seattle. And I've never taken it, but it was something that I was like, that feels very iconic. And I ended up looking up some reference photos, like some interior shots, and seeing a couple different angles, and especially seeing that the monorail actually goes to Seattle Center. So it passes right next to and kind of through where the Space Needle is in the Seattle Center. There's a nice view of the Space Needle like as you go by on the monorail. So I was looking at a couple of references, and there was a bunch that were great, a bunch with like exterior and interior sections, like one where it was like kind of looking halfway in and halfway out, and I thought that was perfect. But the angle and the placement of the Space Needle was just a little too close to the edge of the window. So I ended up moving the Space Needle in my actual image. Now this looks, I'm using a couple reference photos to kind of get the interior and the exterior looking how I wanted it to, but I ended up moving the placement of the Space Needle compared to these references I was looking at, because none of them had the Space Needle kind of out there in the middle of the window view. And I felt like it just kind of like for the composition kind of made more sense to have the Space Needle be a little more out there in the composition. So, and that's something that's perfectly fine, and you should be doing, people really should be doing in their images, in their paintings, is, you have the creative liberties to manipulate and change the world to fit something aesthetically, to fit something that maybe looks good in an actual painting. Just because your reference has this, particular placement of something doesn't mean that the actual final painting really has to have that exact placement or layout. It might not be exact to real life or reality, because maybe the Space Needle doesn't actually line up in that particular shot. If we were to go and recreate it, maybe it doesn't line up. But that's what makes painting so great, or drawing or painting so great, is that you're not limited by the confines of reality and how things are kind of the perspective of things in reality. You get the ability to kind of change things up and move things around in a way that kind of fits the aesthetic of what you're kind of going for. So that was just, a little thing. It wasn't too big, but it definitely made it, I feel like it made the image a little more interesting to have the Space Needle be in that kind of open area, open space in that right window, just to help the composition kind of flow from one direction to the next. Because I feel like the references I was looking at, the Space Needle was just way too close to the window, and it didn't look, it looked a little awkward like that if I were to actually go in and draw or paint specifically from the reference. So again, I'm working on the wood here. It's not my favorite to work on, but I didn't really have the time to go in and gesso the panel, or put something on top of it. I probably could have put like a piece of paper on top of it, but then that, I feel like it kind of defeats the purpose of a cradled panel. Like, cause I'm planning on going through and painting the sides of these panels, probably just a black, just to help kind of frame the actual piece, but also to finish the wood edges. Cause some of the paint kind of, you'll see a little bit later, it kind of spills over the side a little bit when I'm painting the edges. So I do need something to kind of clean up those edges anyway, and I don't want to leave the unfinished wood exposed in these particular pieces. So I'll be going through and cleaning those up with black paint around the cradled edge of this piece. And then like with the previous paintings, I'm including these frog characters. These are also different species of frogs than the previous ones. I was just kind of looking up different frog species. I wasn't really too concerned with like the consistency, like making sure they're the same exact characters. I kind of wanted a little bit of variety in the piece, so I didn't mind having them be from different references. And I think some of it also is to kind of fit the lighting of the scene. Like these frogs had some particular texture on them, which made it a little easier to have them stand out among the shadows inside the monorail. And so I'm going through and painting the background now. I always start with landscapes, working from the background moving forward. And that's a general, workflow that works really well for most paintings, especially when you're layering, like with an acrylic based paint. It's always a really good idea to start with the background and then move forward. So that way you're kind of painting over things instead of having to paint around things if you're doing it the other way around. So with the background, I actually had a lot of fun doing that nice gradient. That's something that really helps to sell the nice, blue sky, especially if you have a sky that doesn't have a lot of things going on in it. Like there's not really any clouds, or it's not necessarily like a, pretty sunset colors. You still want to have that gradient from really dark blue at the top to a nice light blue towards the horizon. Because that just adds a little bit of extra vibrancy to the sky. It adds a little bit of extra interest to an area that's generally just kind of a flat color area. And that is what you'll see in reality. Like a lot of the references I was seeing did have that gradient. Now, it maybe wasn't as exaggerated as I did here. And I think that it's important to, play up some of those effects just to help sell the scene a little bit more, to help sell the environmental lighting. And I can definitely tell in this piece that it's a nice, kind of bright, maybe summer, spring day, something like that, which I found really enjoyable when I was creating this piece. So I'm moving into the interior of the monorail. And again, here I had kind of the same issue as with the light rail. There was a lot of detail that kind of moved back into the distance. A lot of different like chairs and railings, and even like the ceiling that just extended off into the distance. And it made it challenging to try to get things looking natural and not awkward looking with this perspective, because I wanted to make sure that it looked like the monorail was extending into the distance, but I didn't want to necessarily have to render everything out as it went off in that direction. So I ended up doing this kind of a similar thing to the light rail and blurring a lot of details towards the back of the monorail. And that kind of came down to softening various edges, kind of laying in a lot of, shapes that looked approximate, like thinking about simplification, like not about drawing every last little detail there, but thinking about the rough shapes, the larger kind of forms that you might see in the distance there, and pretty much painting in a little bit of what you see, like kind of mimicking what the camera might do if it was not focused there in the background. Like it would abstract a lot of the stuff and the shapes that were back there. So that's what I ended up doing for that section. And I think it turned out pretty good. And yeah, this was actually a pretty quick piece overall, because there was a lot of kind of bigger shapes to go through, not too many small details like with the light rail having all the railings and all the different shapes and things like that. This felt a little simpler, so it ended up going a little bit quicker than the last one. But what I had to do for the frogs is, because I had that green in the background, there were some trees through the windows in the background, I had to change up the color a little bit. Now that green is a little similar, but I made sure to vary up the value, the actual lightness and darkness of the frogs, just to make them stand out a little bit too, because we had the green against green, and you always want to make sure you have some variety in the colors and the tones, just to make sure that it, looks really natural, or that it looks differentiated between those two different colors while I was creating this. And with that, I finished the last two paintings in a series I call The Commuters. Since I've recorded this video, I found out that I got accepted into this show. Now, if you're interested in checking out my work or supporting the show, I'll leave the information about it in the description below. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.